Okay, hello everyone, and thank you very much for coming here and joining with us today for our next inspiration lecture for fall 2021. Today we have with us Dr. Uma R. Karmarkar. She's an assistant professor at the Rady School of Management and in the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Karmarkar holds a dual PhDs in neuroscience from UCLA and in marketing from Stanford GSB. Before her appointment at UCSD, she was a professor in the marketing unit of the Harvard Business School and an affiliate of Harvard Center for Brain Sciences. Dr. Karmarkar's research examines the factors that consciously and unconsciously influence how people make everyday decisions and the implications for marketplace practices. In particular, she looks at how people use their incomplete information when they are faced with uncertain decisions or unfamiliar options and the biases that can emerge from these situations. Our work also explores the ways in which companies' decisions about how and when to offer information can frame consumers' expectations and influence their purchase behavior. Her work has been published in several leading academic journals and has received widespread attention from popular media outlets such as The Economist and The New York Times. So before I leave the floor to Dr. Karmarkar, so there are some simple housekeeping rules to everyone who is attending. Please make sure that your camera and your mics are switched off at all point of time. If you have any question, please write the questions in either the chat box or in the Q&A box. We prefer the Q&A. And the professor will take your questions at the end of the lecture. So thank you very much. Looking forward to a fantastic discussion. The floor is all yours, Dr. Karmarkar.
Thank you so much. Let me ask you one additional housekeeping question. So I know that the way that these talks are set up is that there's a discussion afterwards. So I have about 45, 50 minutes. Is that correct?
That's perfect.
Great.
That's perfect.
And I will try and stay on that time. Well, thank you for the lovely introduction. And thanks to all of you for making time to be here. It's really my pleasure and my honor to get this invitation. And I am so excited to have the opportunity to share some of this work with you. In fact, in receiving the invitation, my biggest question was, how many things could I get to talk about here? So this is a major stream of my research, as Dr. Sen referred to, and I guess I'll dive right in. So the title today is Choosing Without Knowing, or Information Processing in Uncertain Decisions. And you could ask, what defines an uncertain decision? If you haven't chosen something yet, aren't all decisions uncertain to some extent? Now, given that I study this, I love that definition. Sure, absolutely, all decisions are uncertain, but we can be a little bit more precise about what this means, and I can be more precise because by putting some structure on this, we can do a better job of figuring out which decisions these results are more or less relevant for. So how can we accurately describe an uncertain decision? Now, I'm guessing, based on your interests and your training, that many of you have some background in economics, and so we can take definitions of layers of uncertainty and more precise definitions of uncertainty from economic research. So, for example, we can talk about risky decisions, and a risky decision might be something like a coin flip. So if I ask you if you want to bet on whether or not a coin is flipped and comes up on the head side, as we say in the United States, you could flip the coin and you'd know, or you'd have a sense, there are two sides of the coin. The probability of getting the side that you want to bet on is 50%, and the probability of losing is also 50% by definition. Now, imagine a similar kind of question. Imagine that I tell you you want to bet on a sporting event. So I have a picture of US football teams, and I tell you, you're going to bet on purple, and I ask you how much you want to bet. Now, you may sort of feel that the likelihood of purple winning is about 50%. And it may be that you know, that's a reasonable estimate because you don't really know anything about these teams. I haven't given you any statistics. You may never have seen these teams before. And so given that it could be anything from 0 to 100%, 50% is a reasonable estimate. But you can already feel that these are two very different 50% uncertain decisions. And so in both cases, we don't know the outcomes, but there's something different about the way that that the uncertainty is defined. So risk more precisely is known as uncertain outcomes or unknown outcomes with known probabilities. So like the coin flip, 50% likelihood, or you could think of a gamble with a 50-50 likelihood. So suppose I gave you a deck of cards and I said, there are 100 cards in this deck, 50 of them are red, 50 of them are blue, and if I draw a red card from the deck, you win. You'd know that your chances of winning are 50% and your chances of losing are 50%. The second layer of uncertainty is called ambiguity. And again, very likely familiar to many of you on this call. And ambiguity is unknown probabilities with unknown outcomes. So I might say I have a deck of cards. All of them are either colored red or blue, but I'm not going to tell you how many of each color are in the deck. So you know that they are either red or blue. There's no green or yellow or anything funny. But if I pick a red card, you win. And again, your estimate of likelihood of picking a red is probably 50%, but you don't know for sure that that's the probability. It turns out that people really dislike the second layer of uncertainty, ambiguity. It's an extra ignorance of information that people find deeply aversive, and there are hundreds of papers describing and modeling the degree to which we find these aversive. A couple of other interesting things about risk versus ambiguity. Ambiguity is in some ways more flexible, but these two types of uncertainty, even though they clearly relate to each other, are actually distinguishable. They're psychologically different, they are modeled differently in economic models, and even in the brain, the representation of uncertainty coming from risk and ambiguity are different. So part of the reason that I spent so much time explaining such a fundamental economic difference is that there's a lot of importance in understanding ambiguity because it is aversive. And that aversiveness comes from feeling ignorant or uncertain due to lack of information. And this is generally aversive. The aversiveness that comes from this can cause choice avoidance in realms like engaging medical treatment or participating in the stock market or selecting retirement plans. And as you can imagine, these are hugely important consequential consumer decisions. So if we don't know more about ambiguity, we're not going to understand how to help consumers make these decisions and how to speak to consumers making these choices. There are, of course, more everyday choices too, simple ambiguous choices like how do you think about a brand you've never encountered? So models of uncertain decisions in academia, in practice, are often risk models. You've probably heard of risk models or threat risk models in defense contexts. The thing is, my hypothesis, my proposal is that real-world choice really should be ambiguity models. That is, real-world choice often involves ambiguity. When a doctor makes a diagnosis, they don't know the exact probabilities. When a patient receives a diagnosis and is asked what treatment they want to follow, they don't know the exact probabilities of the symptoms or the outcomes there either. When you choose a hotel, you don't know the exact probability that it's going to be a good experience or not, or that they'll have all the amenities that they are promising. Or when you're buying a house, you gather information on this, but again, you don't necessarily know the specific probabilities that are going to lead to this. So if we think about real-world decisions, part of the reason maybe that every decision feels uncertain is that it's not just risk, it's ambiguity related as well. So if there was one takeaway from this talk, it's this principle here, that given that all consumer decisions, or many, not all, many consumer decisions are effectively ambiguous ones, one of the most important psychological principles to keep in mind is that no one wants to look or feel stupid. So by definition, I just said that we don't know the probabilities and we don't know the outcomes, but we still have to make choices. And so people are highly motivated in uncertain situations to find a way to reduce the likelihood that they'll look stupid. They want to look informed. They don't want to feel bad about being ignorant. And as a result, I don't just study ambiguity, I actually study information seeking and information use, because that's our weapon against ambiguity. That's the way that we try and reduce that kind of uncertainty down to risk. So we make tremendous efforts to use information in uncertain choice. Now, being in a business school, of course, I have a picture of a financial trader. For example, he has resources. He wants to apply them to an ambiguous or uncertain situation. And so he's gathering as much information as he can about it, maybe a particular financial prospect. And some of that information will be favorable to the outcome that he wants, and some of it might be unfavorable, and he has to decide how to integrate and use that type of information together. Now, I argue that the woman on the right is doing the same thing. She's trying to decide where to go for dinner. So she has financial resources that can be allocated in the marketplace. She's never been to this restaurant before, so she is trying to gather information. Some of it may be favorable and some of it may be unfavorable to the decision that she wants to make. And eventually she'll have to figure out how to bring all that information together to decide whether this option is of sufficient value that she can then make this choice. We care so much about this ability to gather all the pros and cons, all the information about these topics, that we actually have created entire industries around evaluating information and allowing us to gather it better when we face ambiguous choices. In fact, we don't just like information. So Yelp is a consumer rating site. And of course, there are many, many consumer rating sites all over the world and with different platforms. Beyond this, we also like information about our information. So it's not good enough to just know that a product is rated 4.6 stars. We want to know the full distribution of the star counts. We want to be able to read individual descriptions of what happened. We want to discuss it, 1,023 discussions. By the way, this is a snapshot of a slightly older interface on Amazon.com, and it's for a backpack. So I just, to get a sense of how deeply consumers want to gather this information, there are 1,023 discussions about a backpack, which really has a pretty straightforward utility. So I'm just very briefly taking a look at the question. So do consumers make one of the questions that came in related to how consumers make different decisions in different places where they have more or less information. And I am going to hold that to the end of the talk because I think we'll start speaking to that more and more as I go through. So to decide how consumers make decisions under uncertainty, we need to know how do we use information to make decisions under uncertainty, even when we know that it's never going to be enough to get rid of all of our ignorance. Like, how does the information we have get used? So my agenda today is to spend a little bit of time more as an academic explaining the biases and how consumers use information in uncertain financial choice, and then to explore the implications of these biases in choice settings more broadly, with a quick set of conclusions and some summary at the end. So let's start with this first part. Now, as I said, we have risk and we have ambiguity here, but this was more about what kind of information you do or don't have. The interesting thing about risk is that the information that you have is yoked together. It's correlated. That is, if I tell you you have a 50% chance of winning, you know you have a 50% chance of losing. So it's really hard to untangle or pull apart the information that you get in risk, right? If I tell you you have a 25% chance of winning, you know you have a 75% chance of losing. 75% chance of winning, you already know the losing probabilities. So there's no real missing information here, because even if I only tell you about the winning part, you know the losing part, and vice versa. Ambiguity is complex in the real world, represents these questions, but also gives us flexibility on information because some of it is missing. So if I tell you there are at least 25% chance of you winning and at least a 25% chance of you losing, for example, there's still that 50% of the information that you don't know. So I can tell you differing amounts of winning and losing information, and they don't automatically reveal the opposite side. So over here, if my starting question was how do we use information to make decisions under uncertainty, because I'm interested in studying ambiguity, where some of the information is going to go unknown, I can ask a more sophisticated question. I can ask, how do we weight favorable versus unfavorable information to estimate value to make decisions under uncertainty? And I will pause to ask a question that came up in the chat very briefly, where someone asked whether AI programs can be formulated to help people make decisions which are uncertain or ambiguous. Potentially they can. One of the challenges is that what helping people really looks like. So what we're going to untangle here is how do we use information, and the reason we want to know that is what information is the most useful, what information affects our decisions the most. And until we understand that, it's really hard to design these AIs, because even if they tell us a lot of things, that's not the same thing as us learning a lot of things. So what kind of information processing biases might exist? Well, an economist would say that there should be balance. You have winning or favorable information, and you have losing or unfavorable information. And favorable information or winning should make you see more value, and unfavorable information should make you see less value, but the magnitude of their effect should be similar. In contrast, psychological research for decades has suggested that favorable information is much more impactful, that we're going to overweight this, it's all we're going to pay attention to, and it's called optimism bias, or there's this principle of motivated reasoning that we only look at the things that support what we want. And so if you're asking me to play a gamble with 100 cards in a deck, I'm just going to pay attention to the stuff that tells me about winning. Now, interestingly enough, despite the volume of psychological research suggesting we overweight favorable information, there's an equivalent volume of research saying we overweight unfavorable information. So you probably have heard the saying, one bad apple spoils the bunch. You may have heard of the term negativity bias, or you could think of this as a pessimism bias. There's Nobel Prize winning research on prospect theory, which was a way of interpreting whether we pay more attention to losses versus gains. And in prospect theory, again, losses loom larger than gains, and it's been shown many times that we overpay attention to those complex things in ways that prioritize loss. So how is this possible? How are we simultaneously overweighting favorable information and overweighting? You can't overweight both at the same time. It's either it's balanced or it's not. And because this actually hadn't been studied before, this was an open question before we ran our research. So this is the very simple pro versus con task that we designed to explore this question. Imagine that there are 100 red or blue poker chips in a bag. Again, only red or blue, no funny greens or yellows or anything crazy. And if I draw one from, I'm going to play a gamble, where I draw one chip from the bag, and if it's a red chip, you win. So the more red chips I tell you about, the more favorable information to you winning that you have. And in these experiments, we ask people to imagine playing games with several of these paper bags full of chips. And each game says, you know, this bag contains at least X red and at least Y blue chips, right? So at least 25 red and at least 30 blue chips. Now notice, again, that still leaves a bunch of chips where you don't know what color they are. Or I can even say the most extreme version, you know nothing about the specific color ratio of the bag. So if I vary the amount of favorable and unfavorable information that people get, I can measure how much adding a little bit of favorable information changes their value for this gamble. And I can measure the amount that a little unfavorable information changes their value for the gamble, and I can see whether those amounts are similar or different. So I'll show you data from a specific experiment. We've run hundreds of these with different versions. The stakes were $50 if I drew a red chip and $0 if I drew a blue chip from the bag. There were 9 different bags of poker chips, and I changed the amount of red and blue information people saw, the amount of favorable or unfavorable information. And then I asked people, how much are you willing to pay to play one of these gambles? So if you have at least 25 red chips and at least 25 blue chips, how much would you pay me for a ticket to make me actually pull a chip from the bag and play the game? And I wanted to show you the raw data because I think it's a really interesting way of seeing what was going on, and we can expand this to more common everyday consumer decisions in a little bit. So on this axis here, hopefully you can see my pointer, are the favorable chips, and on this axis down here are the unfavorable chips. So if you go from blue to orange to green, that's adding more information about the number of favorable chips in the bag. And you notice that as you add more information, these bars increase. There's also a very nice point. I mentioned earlier that people really hate not knowing probabilities. Notice these 2 bars. Here, you know nothing about the number of blue chips and you know nothing about the number of red chips, and people are willing to pay about $3.80 for the gamble. Now in the top right corner, you know that there are 50 red and 50 blue, so this is the risk situation, and people are willing to pay about $11 for the gamble. So even in this data, you can already see that aversion to ambiguity. When we have a perfect risk 50-50, people are willing to pay $11. When it's an implied ambiguity 50-50, people's value drops all the way down to less than $4. So again, as I said, as the number of red chips goes up, so as you go from blue to orange to green, it looks like willingness to pay, the value of the gamble goes up. But if you go from the left to the right of these bars, there really isn't much change. That is, surprisingly, adding more information about the number of blue chips doesn't really change how much you value the gamble. And we can show that in a very simple regression analysis. So if we look at how much willingness to pay is dependent on the amount of favorable information versus the amount of unfavorable information, there's a significant contribution to willingness to pay from favorable, and not even a significant contribution of unfavorable. So the way we'd interpret that is it looks like optimism bias, right? It looks like favorable information is impacting decision-making much more than unfavorable information. And in fact, we find this kind of result in a lot of situations. So I won't make you look at that much more of this experimental data. We let people choose whether red versus blue was the winning color. We saw the same effect. We looked at an insurance game where instead of being about winning money, it was about losing or keeping money away from a loss. And we still see that people show an optimism bias, seem to be paying attention to favorable information. We played these games for real money. We handed out cash in the lab, still favorable. What if it was for winning prizes like chocolates instead of money? Maybe money makes you do some kind of weird calculation that's making mistakes. No, we still saw a weighting of favorable information. Maybe there's something weird. Maybe a bunch of people said they wouldn't ever be willing to pay for the gamble. Maybe there's a bunch of zeros screwing up all these averages. No, when we can take out the people who said zero. First of all, most of the time, very few people say zero. Everybody's willing to gamble a little bit. So basically, we still see favorable information. And what about judging non-financial situations? What if I told you, like, what's the likelihood, or, let's say I say the temperature in San Diego, which is where I am, was under 60 degrees last week. True or false? And I gave you some information that suggested it was true and some information that suggested it was false. People overweighted the information that suggested that it was true. I have a question specific to these gambles where someone asked, Rohan Garg asked, why is it that people are willing to pay more when they know that unfavorable blue chips are at least 25 and red chips are 50 compared to when the situation is 50-50? Shouldn't it be the opposite? That's a really nice thing that you noticed there. I'm going to back up for just 1 second and show that. So I think he's talking about this. That's a little weird. That bar looks very high. Now this is not statistically significantly different from here. I didn't show the variance in these, but it does look like this goes up a little bit, and we'll get back to that. That was a very good thing to notice. Yes, it's weird, right? Why would increasing the amount of unfavorable information make people more likely to pay? So is it that we have an optimism bias? Well, no. And Rohan noticed this weirdness in here. Like, what is happening? It's not just this bar that's weird. Actually, all these middle bars are weird. It looks like adding 20 information about 25 blue chips actually made willingness to pay go up. It made the financial value go up a little bit. That's surprising. Now, in some of these bars, it's significant, and in some it isn't. But it suggests that maybe there's something going on here that we're not capturing. Maybe it's not just optimism bias, because it looks like blue chips are doing something. They're just doing something weird. So we looked at our other experiments to see if odd things were happening when you added some blue information, and odd things do appear to be happening. And so we had to really think about core principles here. Like, why what are we missing? And what we hadn't thought enough about was this idea that no one wants to look or feel stupid. The aversiveness of ambiguity comes from feeling uncertain or being aware of ignorance. So in that case, information can be acting on both risk and ambiguity in different ways. So let's think about this. What is information inform? What is telling you more red or blue chips inform? Well, it tells you whether or not you're more or less likely to win, right? More red chips means more likely to win. More blue chips means less likely to win. But if you think of these poker bags as if you think of these bags of poker chips as this bar, right? And if I told you all of the red and blue, I would fill this whole bar. In ambiguity, I haven't filled the whole bar. But the more red or the more blue chips I tell you about, the more of the bar I fill. So information tells you whether you're more or less likely to win, but it also tells you how precise your information is. It tells you how certain you should be that your estimates of the probability are correct. The more information you have, the more you can narrow down to something more like risk. So here, then we need to think about what's happening. And I'm gonna walk through this just a tiny bit slowly. I know you guys are clever enough to manage this much faster, but this is kind of the core of the finding that we'll build on in the last 20 or so minutes. So just take it for granted right now that both knowing that you're more likely to win and being more confident that that estimate is correct, both of these things increase the value of a decision. What does favorable information do? Well, it makes you more likely to win, and it makes you more confident that your estimate of that likelihood is correct. So favorable information does two positive things to value. Unfavorable information is a little weird. It makes you less likely to win, so it should decrease value. But it also reduces your uncertainty. It also makes you more certain. It also makes that gray bar shrink, right? The gray bar is the part that we hate. The unknown is what we hate. So even though unfavorable information is bad for you winning, it's good for your feelings of certainty. And the more certain you feel, the more value you see. So maybe it's not that we have optimism bias. Maybe it's that the unfavorable information is canceling itself out. It does some things that raise value and some things that decrease value, and so net, it has no overall or very little overall effect. It's not that it has no effect, it's just doing lots of different things at the same time. I'm just going to pause here in case anybody has questions about this picture. In the meantime, I'm going to answer a question that's shown up from Devyani Gupta, where she asks, if in risk, isn't it possible that people might not be ready for what the future has for them? Because in ambiguity, people are more open and acceptable to more than one interpretation that might keep them more ready. That's a really lovely interpretation, and yes, that's certainly possible. What we tend to find is that even though it depends on the individual and how comfortable they are with the unknown. Risk does have, because both risk and ambiguity have unknown outcomes. So, in a sense, you can think of this as a complicated ambiguity. You both have all the problems that come along with risk, and you have the additional ignorance of not knowing whether you have estimated those problems accurately. So when there's something to lose, people generally find ambiguity more aversive. Now, this is a winning gamble that I'm describing, but you could lose out on winning. And again, people don't like to feel stupid. So that's where the tension in ambiguity comes from. So let's check and see if all these things that I proposed were correct. So we have 100 chips, all red or blue, draw one, same game that I showed you before, and we varied the amount of information that people got, many more levels, not just 25 and 25 now, but like 18 red chips and 42 blue chips and a whole bunch of different things. And we asked them, how much are you willing to pay for the gamble? But we also asked some questions to check and see if that crazy diagram was right. So we asked, what do you think's going to win? You estimate the probabilities. Tell us what you're thinking. Do you think it's more likely red or more likely blue? And how certain are you about that estimate? How certain do you feel? And what we find is data that supports the diagram that I showed you. That is, I can again show regression analyses if people are interested, but I thought I'd just sort of describe the findings here. We find that red information or winning favorable chip information does increase your estimate of the likelihood you're going to win, and losing information decreases it. This is exactly what the economists would predict, right? We're not ignoring the blue information. It makes us recognize that a blue chip is more likely to be drawn. But both red and blue information reduce our ignorance, right? Now we know more about the colors of the chips in the bag. So they both increase our certainty. So even when blue information is making us less likely to win, it makes us more confident that we know what's going on. Now I said you just have to assume that, or I asked you to take it on faith, that likelihood of winning and certainty both increased value. And I can show that they do from this data. So when we measured it, the more red chips I told you about, the more likely the more likely you thought red was to get pulled from the bag, the more money you were willing to pay for the gamble. But the more certain you were, even if you were more certain that it was a bad gamble, the more certain you felt about knowing the probabilities, the more likely you were to pay for a gamble. So both your estimate of risk and your confidence in that estimate matter when we're making decisions. And that's really one of our key insights into this field, which had not actually been shown directly prior to our research. So again, I have the regression results here. Both likelihood and certainty have a significant positive impact on willingness to pay. And if you look at the numbers, the sizes, the magnitude of that impact are similar. Like they're both similarly important when we make our decisions. So it's not just about, is it 50-50 or not? Is it 50-50 and how good do you feel about that estimate? How confident are you? So a quick summary of what I've shown you up to this point. Favorable information appears to have a stronger effect on value in uncertain decisions or ambiguous choice, but the causes are more complicated than they look. Subjective certainty, that is how confident you feel, has a real and financially relevant value. And this is the first time that it actually been shown in an economic situation. It plays a super important role in determining what looks like biased reactions to ambiguous decisions. So I want to explore the implications of these now. We've gotten a couple of great questions about how this matters in everyday decision making. Now, one thing is, it looks like we are biased to look at favorable information. Now, we've seen that there are a complex set of reasons for this bias, but how else can we use these insights? Well, I mentioned that I think that the person making that financial decision is very similar to the kind of decision that they make when they're making uncertain product or service decisions, like choosing to go to a restaurant. So we ran a study where we told people they have a great opportunity to have the tasting menu dinner at a new upscale restaurant. This dinner would consist of 7 courses or dishes that the chef chooses or creates each night. The restaurant named Sonnet has a lot of positive attention. It seems really nice. But since the chef frequently changes the options featured on the menu, you don't know exactly what will or will not be included in the dinner. So some people only saw this basic description, and then other people got favorable or unfavorable information or both. So they've heard, for example, for favorable information, they heard maybe you learned that some past menus have featured at least 2 of your all-time favorite dishes. For unfavorable information, they might hear, you learned that some past menus have included at least 2 dishes you wouldn't be interested in. what would we predict? Well, we would predict based on those prior financial studies that both favorable and unfavorable information should make you feel like you know more about the restaurant. They should make you feel more informed, more certain, more knowledgeable. But favorable information is going to influence your willingness to pay for the meal much more than the unfavorable information. And that's exactly what we found when we asked people. So when we asked people, both the favorable and unfavorable information made them feel more knowledgeable about the restaurant, and that increased their willingness to pay. But the favorable information had the most impact on willingness to pay overall, and the effect of the unfavorable information was non-significant. So in an extreme version, getting a mediocre review doesn't necessarily mean that people are automatically not going to come to your restaurant. A second example for this is when consumers are uncertain, reassuring messaging can help. So people don't like looking stupid, they don't like ignorance, and they like certainty, right? So now we know something really important about how they make decisions. So we showed ads to certain and uncertain consumers, people who were feeling really confident about their day-to-day life versus people who were feeling really underconfident about their day-to-day life. And so they saw the different people in different situations saw two different kinds of ads. One half of the people saw ads that said, that talked about this umbrella, and it's very portable, and it goes into your car glove box, and it's called the NACO. So the NACO micro umbrella. Why? Because every day brings uncertainty, right? So you always want this on hand. The other half of people saw an ad that talked about certainty. The NACO micro, leave your house with certainty every day. What we find is that on the right here, you'll see certain consumers. So these people on the right are people who are feeling confident about their lives, about the world around them, and they don't care which ad they see. They like both ads the same. So we ask people, like, how likely would you be to purchase this umbrella? And they like it doesn't matter which ad they see. But people who are currently feeling uncertain about the world, like many of us these days, with the world changing quickly and health issues on the forefront, people who feel uncertain about the world like ads better, or like the product better, when it talks about making them feel more certain or more safe or more confident. So by showing how important certainty is in decision making, we can actually realize, we can predict that messaging people about certainty has a financial value to them that makes products look more attractive. A third context for applying these is strengthening the link between information and certainty. So in all the examples that I've given you so far, the more information you have, the more certain you feel, right? Information reduces ignorance and makes you feel more certain. But sometimes if you give people too much information, it kind of goes past the place where it makes you feel more confident, and it can actually make you feel less confident. So one of the things that my experimental results teach us is that firms need to be really careful to make sure that when they provide information, it's making consumers more confident, not less confident. Because the less confident they are, the more they're going to feel that ambiguity aversion, and the more they're going to walk away from the decision. So I want to stress the idea that comes from this research that informative is more useful than information. In some ways, too much information can actually make us feel uncertain or make us make dumb decisions because we're just trying to get away from feeling like we don't know what's going on. And a really important example of that in the cybersecurity space is the terms of service agreements that the digital companies offer. Like, before you can sign up for, I don't know, Instagram, for example, you have to sign a terms of service agreement, and it's often very long and no one reads it. In fact, this website, Terms of Service Didn't Read, was created because they know no one reads the terms of service agreements. But that's kind of shocking, right? Terms of service agreements are contracts that we are signing every single day with companies, and we never read any of these contracts? Well, it's because they have so much information. They list everything, and it should be that listing information makes us feel more certain, but there's so much information and it's so hard to understand that in this case, more information actually means less certainty. And that's going to create its own kind of biases. We saw how important certainty was for making decisions. So if we get less certainty, it's going to create its own kind of biases. It might even make us just walk away from the decision or just walk away from the information because we're too scared, we're too stressed out to engage with it. And in fact, this is exactly what happens in many consumer situations. So the proposal to fix this is we want to make sure that the knowledge that we provide consumers, the objective knowledge, creates feelings of knowledge, that is subjective knowledge. Information that's difficult to evaluate can create more uncertainty. And information that reveals that your consumers are ignorant also creates uncertainty. A really nice example of that is some research done by Hadar, Sood, and Fox in 2013. They gave people huge amounts of information about 401k plans. In the United States, these are retirement plans. So it helps you save money in your company for retirement. And basically, they gave people these huge, some people just got a short description of the plan and what made each plan different from each other. And some people got huge books of all of the details of each plan. And the people who got huge books of all the details were so intimidated because they couldn't use that information productively. And they just never chose a retirement plan at all. They walked away from the decision. So instead of getting help to save for retirement from their own company, by giving them too much information, they ended up with no choice at all. I'm going to pause briefly here, just check the questions quickly to make sure there's no clarification. These are more broad questions, so I think we're okay. And I'll answer some of those hopefully in the discussion point as well. So a fourth place where ambiguity becomes extremely important is potentially in terms of understanding entrepreneurship. So a lot of effort is put in understanding like what makes a good entrepreneur and how can you become a good entrepreneur. And one of the possibilities is that we're starting to see some evidence that entrepreneurs may be more tolerant of ambiguity than people who have the same kind of expertise but choose to go into more traditional firms. So again, tolerance for ambiguity means that you're okay with that kind of uncertainty. It doesn't stress you out as much not knowing specific probabilities. And you could imagine that entrepreneurs really have to handle ambiguity much more than people in traditional companies. If you're drawing a regular salary, you don't have to worry about uncertainty as much as someone whose decisions can make or break an entire business. Now, I showed you applications of this understanding of ambiguity and certainty in primarily consumer and business domains. I am a dual appointment in the policy school, and I believe that policy and business need to speak closely to one another for us to have successful economies going forward. So I thought I'd just mention that we've also shown in experimental studies and different kinds of research that understanding ambiguity tolerance can also help us in developing policy. Just for example, we find, just like entrepreneurs can be more or less tolerant, when we look at psychiatric disorders or psychiatric non-normal behavior, most of the ways that people study this are by thinking about whether or not people with psychiatric disorders engage in risky behavior. It's always described as a risk model. Like, do people with impulse disorders, are they too comfortable with risk? And I think we get a lot of power out of seeing not risk, but what about how these people feel about ambiguity? Are they okay with not knowing what the outcomes of their not traditional actions will be? So we actually looked at people from a community sample in a city in the United States, and we had them fill out a diagnosis for antisocial personality disorder. So this is a recognized psychiatric disorder that makes you more or less likely to behave in ways that are antisocial and not thoughtful about your community. And it turns out that people who have antisociality disorder are less ambiguity averse than people who are diagnosed as typical. So let me put that in more regular language. Most of us who are neurotypical or who don't have this disorder are a little concerned about uncertainty. We find ambiguity a little bit aversive, and so we might make more cautious or decisions where we try and find more information out. People who have antisocial personality disorders are a little more devil may care. They don't care if there's more information. There might be bad outcomes to their choices for the community, but that's not their problem. And so they're more comfortable with living with that uncertainty and doing what they want to do anyway. We can also look at ambiguity tolerance in post-traumatic stress disorder. This is often the kind of psychiatric disorder that happens when people have gone through an extreme trauma. You see it frequently in members of the military. I won't walk you through each piece of this graph. The point of the graph is just to show that people who have PTSD, that is these dark gray bars, show similar patterns for risk compared to neurotypical people. These differences are not significant. But when you look at their attitudes towards ambiguity, when you look at the way that they process ambiguity, it's similar to typical people for gains, but really, really different for losses on the right here. And so we've actually found an economic way of defining one of the psychiatric disorders in PTSD, and we might be able to understand post-traumatic stress disorder a little bit better by understanding what kinds of decisions are going to be hard or difficult or non-typical for people who are struggling with these issues. Finally, again, I won't go through some of the details of the neuroscience, but I'm happy to discuss it afterwards. I am actually a neuroeconomist, as was mentioned. But we actually may also be able to understand how political orientation changes information processing and uncertain choice. In the United States, for example, people with more conservative views are more averse to uncertainty. More conservative people hate not knowing specific black and white outcomes. And so Republicans, for example, tend to seek out certainty even more than Democrats do. In fact, people who are afraid or sensitive to ambiguity actually interpret information in more of a polarized way. So if something's kind of vague or gray in the middle, if you are very sensitive to ambiguity and you don't like it, you interpret it as more black and white because that helps you feel less uncertain and less ignorant. So when we talk about political polarization in the United States and in many parts of the world, one of the things that's contributing to polarization is this tolerance for ambiguity or lack of tolerance for ambiguity that causes people to want to pull apart, but pull apart in ways that make it very clear who's right and who's wrong, or who's better and worse, or black and white. So there are lots of lovely questions, and I'm coming up to the end of my time here. I just want to mention a couple of overall conclusions and summaries, and then dig into some of the ideas that hopefully this conversation has sparked. I think I'm just going to give the broadest level of summary. Ambiguity, I'm proposing, and my research proposes, that ambiguity may be a better model than risk for decision-making under uncertainty. Ambiguity aversion means that feeling certain has a meaningful economic value during decision-making, and it's not something that we've been really paying enough attention to when we try and think about consumer choice. This isn't, and when people process information, they're not just showing an optimism bias. They actually have asymmetric effects of favorable and unfavorable information that's driven by many different mechanisms at the same time. Estimation of risk, as feelings of certainty, and many other interpretations of the information that they're getting from the world around them. And finally, individual differences, the way that different people process information in ambiguity, and so ambiguity aversion and information evaluation, these differences relate to meaningful patterns of choice in a range of market and policy settings. So not only can we make some general predictions about how people will respond to information in the marketplace, we can also start to learn a little bit more about how different kinds of people might respond in different ways depending on how the information impacts their feelings of confidence and how much they want things to be more precise versus how comfortable they are with the uncertainty that ambiguity brings. I am right on time, it looks like, so I think I'm going to stop there. I just wanted to thank my collaborators in a lot of the research that I showed you. Alex Pesakovich and I designed this task together when we were both at Harvard. He's a data analyst at Facebook now. Um, I wasn't able to show some of the brain data, but we can show neural differences in processing favorable and unfavorable information under ambiguity, and that was work largely done with Joshua Buchholz, who is also at Harvard University, and several really talented research fellows that have worked on this project. So again, I look forward to digging into the questions, and I wanted to thank you for your attention, and again, thank our host so much for the invitation. Um, Dr.
Thank,
Sen,
thank you so much. Yes.
no, I was just saying, what's the best way to proceed forward?
Well, we have quite a few questions here. So let me just read some out to you. So one question we have from my colleague George says, we think of risk and ambiguity to be where the odds are known versus unknown. I'm assuming that in both these cases, the options are known. Is there something other than ignorance that defines a situation where neither the odds nor the options are known?
Neither the odds nor the options, right? So I have been defining things, for example, as having number of red and blue chips, but maybe there's a situation where there is a hidden green somewhere, there might be even more options. Yeah, so I wanted to make sure, I mean, as it is, I crammed as much into this talk as I could, but I wanted to make sure that I mostly dealt with situations where this is a little bit more concrete for the sake of um, being able to finish today's talk. But so I personally refer to the situation you're talking about as unbounded ambiguity.
Yeah.
That is, not only are there options, but there could be information that we don't even know we could know about, so to speak, or an awareness that there might be more options there and we don't even know how to access that. The same biases tend to hold. That is, the more information we have, the more certainty we have about this, the more helpful it is. You again see a favorable bias weight in these situations with unbounded ambiguity. Obviously, the quantification of this gets a little bit messier, but the important criteria on these types of insights in that type of situation is really about whether you're aware that there are some shadowy options that could exist or not. So in a sense, I realize this is a bit silly way of framing it, but if you don't know what you don't know, you're okay with it. We're okay with being ignorant if no one points out that we're ignorant. And that's really why I like this, I know it's a bit of a cute description, but no one likes to look or feel stupid. If I don't know that I look stupid, I'm okay with it. So it really comes down to how I feel as opposed to the absolute truth of the situation. And I think that's one of the nice things about blending some of these ideas from psychology with economics, because with economics, we want to make sure that we precisely defined exactly what the objective reality of the situation is, and that's what we model. It turns out that if we model the psychology of what people know, don't know, how much they care, that kind of thing, we can actually get a little bit of nuance that adds into some of these decisions that maybe wasn't captured by that objective representation.
Thank you. There is a related question, and that has come from Swikriti. So, in one of her questions, she has asked, do you think ambiguity is subjective? And because a lot of people do not even look at the information available before taking a decision, whereas some people do, go out of their way to do research before taking a decision. So, ambiguity might look different to each one of these people.
Absolutely. Absolutely, no question. I mean, I probably couldn't say it better than you can. So there's a difference among human beings. And again, this is cross-cultural, because I know that a lot of research tends to focus on Western cultures, but this particular difference has been shown cross-cultural. It's even got a really straightforward name. It's called need for cognition. So some people, like you said, need to find answers more clearly. They want to make sure that they know how much information is out there and how much they have. And so they, in a sense, expose themselves to ambiguity more because they have this drive to make sure that they understand not only all the information they have easily, but the full space of that possibility. And once you know the full space, you know what parts of the space you're missing. Some people never want to read the terms of service. You like ignorance is bliss, right? They never want to read it. They don't want to know about it. If you don't tell me, I don't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
Now, notice that both people are ambiguity averse in this scenario that I've drawn. But one person is running away from any possibility that ambiguity could get them, and the other one is like, I know I hate it, but I still want to know.
Yeah.
I want to know that I'm in the place that I don't like. So that's one section of your question. Yes, absolutely. Ambiguity can be felt subjectively because some people really need to know and some don't, and the degree to which we feel ambiguity in any one situation depends on how much we recognize our ignorance or not. But the other thing is, I've mostly focused on ambiguity where we're looking for these kinds of information to make decisions. There are situations where we're perfectly okay with ambiguity. In fact, we're ambiguity seeking. We like surprise parties. We like grab bags. We like windfall cash. We like situations where there's a possibility that some wonderful surprise could happen. We like the excitement of going out on a blind date that might turn out to be great. So it's in consumer decision making, the most common situation tends to be ambiguity aversion, but the way that we feel that if it's felt as ignorance, I think that's a really good representation of the aversion to ambiguity. If it's felt as just unknown is not always a bad thing.
This reminds me of this. There's been this recent news I read. It's about some photo editing app on your phone, which somebody pointed out that it uploads all the users' photos to a server, somewhere, and they do not delete these photos. So people have stopped downloading the app, and so I think do you think that when you're talking about different apps and different softwares, and now that we have significant raised concern about privacy, so these are also applicable there. So people are more worried about what kind of information they get and how much ambiguity there is.
Yes, and in fact, I think that this is where, again, almost like the prior question, that you find people sorting in really interesting ways. Some people just don't want to think about it too much and don't want to know. So again, they don't read the terms of service, they don't check too carefully, they might not check the news. But because we have because more people are paying more attention to privacy and security, that does affect these kinds of apps more and more now, because people might not want to know all the details, but they have targets now. There are particular domains of knowledge like privacy where they want to know, and even political regulation. So different regulations on cookies and do not sell my information rules for websites, for example, have meant that even if you didn't really want to know what was happening, even if you kind of wanted to let it go, you're forced to make that decision in an active sense. So I actually have had conversations like this with major technology firms where they want to have this, even when they want to have this conversation with the users, even when they're not trying to hide what they're doing, the conversation itself is so tricky, because the more you tell people, the more you're showing them how vulnerable they are and how much they don't know. So in that case, they're saying, okay, they're worried. So we'd like to give them information, but the information we give them makes them more worried. So that's not actually that helpful. So we as consumers have sort of put ourselves in a place where we have less tolerance for ambiguity on topics like privacy, partially because we had to. And again, if you have a privacy breach or a security hack, it's effectively shown you the impact of that ignorance. Right? It's not just that we don't want to look or feel stupid. It's even worse if someone points it out or if someone exploits it. So it makes it unignorable to us. And as a result, in some ways, you could argue that we all have to be a little bit more tolerant of uncertainty, because we have to go looking for this information that we don't really know that much about. But it also means that this is another domain where, if you look for a restaurant, you want to see the ratings, you want to see how good the food is and how clean it is. If you look for an app, you now want to check. It's a new thing on the checklist where we look for that kind of information. But if a company tells us, hey, don't worry, there is this little downside, but there are all these upsides, my data suggests that telling us about the downside makes us feel like we understand what's going on. So the more transparent companies are about the small downsides, the more we're able to focus on those big upsides. It's good for easier decision making. It has some potential concerns in terms of whether, companies might take advantage of that.
So, this was actually one of my next questions, that how much should a company reveal? Right? So this everybody is on Amazon. You just show this screenshot where some 1,200 people talking about a backpack. So it's very difficult for companies to hide some information, unfavorable information about a product, because people will talk.
It's interesting.
Uh,
yeah.
So the question, my question was, because this has been asked by one of our MBA students. He has asked that how much information should a company choose to disclose, because it might not want to disclose some information, but people will talk, and that information will come out once people start using it, and they start realizing that this is something that is not really right with the product.
Absolutely. So this gets a little further away from some of the more basic psychological economic research and more firmly into applied marketing, which is great. I just wanted to say things I'm about to say I no longer have perfect data for. It's a hard question, and it also taps into the general current market trend of authenticity and how important authenticity is. So we've talked about uncertainty, which is really in some sense distrust. And the complement to that companies want to create is trust. Now, the opposite of distrust is not necessarily trust, right? Just because I don't distrust you doesn't mean I trust you necessarily. So when we talk about, how much information should the companies disclose? One of the things you brought up was, well, if they don't disclose everything, other people will tell us. That's really bad, because that creates distrust, right? It ruins the perception of authenticity. It makes us think that everything is okay, and then it drops us below that expectation. That's a very big risk for these firms. So you definitely don't want to have the impression that you're hiding something, because I think that is one of the most dangerous information asymmetries that you can get between a firm and a consumer. The implication that you hid information so that I can't evaluate it means you forced ignorance on me. Very unpleasant. And distrustful, and breaks the sort of implicit contract of authenticity that I'm looking for. On the other hand, if you don't tell me everything and I find it out because it's sort of unexpected or weird or unusual, or you wouldn't be expected to tell me these things, like I like the restaurant examples because they're so rich here. I'm a restaurant, and some people don't like cheese, and there's cheese in a whole bunch of my recipes. If people come and say, look, I hated this place because there's cheese in everything, it's not really because the restaurant didn't sufficiently well disclose that their chef likes cheese a lot. Right? So at that point, it's a matter of preference or interpretation or experience that might vary between individuals. And so there's less of a danger for those kinds of bits of information. So I think, when we think about the information technology space or apps, information that's framed in a way that we can easily digest it, and that gives access to transparency, is one of the best things that firms can do. So, here's a summary of what we do for you. If you want more detail, click here, right? So that there's no perception that it's being withheld. You don't have to learn everything. I'm not going to make you go through the full terms of service. Here are the top 6 things, but I'm not holding anything back. If you want to read through all of it, it's all here, just in case. And so that allows some trade-off between that level of, overwhelming or not disclosing, or, someone's like, aha, they didn't, in the reviews, someone says, they didn't tell us this, but it's true. No, we told you. It's all in that list. You're welcome to go through and find anything else. So that we're getting to the point now where those information asymmetries, or just how much you should tell, almost becomes a negotiation between the firm and the consumer, making the customer feel informed, but and having access and transparency to the information, but not spilling so much information everywhere that consumers are turned off by how expert they have to be before they can make a simple decision.
Thank you so much. I'll just take one last question, and if the attendees they have any other question, we are coming to an end of this lecture, and it's really late in San Diego, so you can collect the question, send it to me, and I'll share those with Dr. Karmarkar. So just take one last question. It's from Stanley Ashish, and so what he says is a question that I also wanted to ask you. So you have worked with this brain data, right? So brain mapping data for consumers. Do you think that emotions, play any role in the decision making? So the state the consumers are at, some might be angry, some might be depressed or sad or happy. So does that make any? It does.
Yeah, it definitely does, and it's a tough question for me to end on, because this is one thing where suddenly I don't have enough information for you guys. It definitely has an effect. Emotions change how we process information, separately from ambiguity or anything else. That's just a thing we know about emotions. Emotions change how we process information. They can also bias us to look more pessimistic or more optimistic. In fact, depressed people are often like those people that I said had high need for cognition. It's actually been shown that that people who have clinical depression have very high need for cognition. They are information seekers. They look for all the details. So we can already assume that if depression changes the way that you look for information, it's going to change the way you interact with uncertainty. In some sense, it's not, the disorders I showed are not specifically emotional disorders, but they do affect emotion regulation, like post-traumatic stress disorder. And we saw that people with post-traumatic stress disorder have different ambiguity sensitivities, particularly when it comes to losing. So we know there's definitely a relationship, but it's not, I don't think we know enough about the brain yet to know whether it's so simple as, being happy makes you more ambiguity sensitive, being sad makes you, we don't have those sort of one-to-one mappings yet. We're just starting to figure out how particular elements do or don't interact in the larger scope of these clinical settings. I will say that for typical brain results, so people who don't necessarily have a disorder, we do see that they process information differently in their brain, so that favorable information is processed by certain circuits that are more related to reward, and unfavorable information is more processed by other circuits that are also related to reward, but more in a sort of salience or arousal or even emotional standpoint.
Okay, thank you so much, for the answer. This has been a fantastic lecture, and I'm sure that everyone has enjoyed it. And we have come to an end of the session. So I'd say thank you very much, Dr. Karmarkar, for coming here and delivering this amazing lecture. And I hope that when all this travel normalizes, we'll have the good fortune to host you in our campus. It's a beautiful green campus, right outside Delhi. We'll be very happy if you come over and spend a day with us, interact with our peers as well as the students. It'll be a great honor. And once again, thank you very much for joining. And I know it's pretty late in San Diego, but thank you very much. And also thank you all the attendees who have joined us today. I can see lots of my faculty colleagues have joined, the students have joined, people from outside the university have joined. Thank you all very much for coming here this morning and attending this lecture. And thank you so much, Dr. Karmarkar. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, you are so kind. I really, like I said, first of all, I would love to come. I would be so delighted to be able to come to Delhi, but also just, yes, it was so lovely, and the questions are so thoughtful, and expansive and interesting. You could build, you know, a whole career on some of the questions that people have asked. So I really appreciate having the opportunity to be in front of an audience like this.
Thank you very much. And the pleasure is all ours.
I just, you know, I realize people are probably, you know, finishing up and signing off. I'd be happy to respond to some of the other questions. I don't know if there's a mechanism for doing so. I posted my contact information here, but please feel free to follow up with me if there's anything else I can offer in that respect.
Sure. I you know, I can do one thing, and I can collate the questions. I can all the questions that are unanswered. I'm sure that, you know, after I shared the video with the students and the participants, you know, there will be more questions when they revisit the lectures. So I can ask the questions from them, and I can, you know, make a probably Word file, and I can share those questions with you, and sometime in future.
Yeah, and I'm happy to do whatever I can to answer them.
Sure, we'll do that. Thank you very much.
Have a lovely day. I was going to say evening. Have a lovely day.
Very good night to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.